EVO. There are seasons that feel like they tell the truth, and seasons that seem to lie to us. The honest winters are the loud ones, the winters that arrive with warning, the ones filled with storms that slam into the world with force, carving roads shut, rattling windows, and reminding us that nature has teeth. Those winters are frightening, yes, but at least they declare themselves. At least they show us exactly who they are. But there's another kind of winter, a more subtle and more dangerous one, the sort that creeps in quietly and settles across neighborhoods like a soft disguise. In these winters, the air feels hushed, the sky stays low, the world looks manageable and familiar, but nothing seems urgent, until you realize that the cold has seeped into you so slowly, so gently even, that you can't quite remember the last time you actually felt warm. February 2001 was that kind of winter in Bogota, New Jersey. Not far from where I grew up in Jefferson. It's about 30 miles east on the way to New York, a suburb of Manhattan. Now, Bogota was not the sort of place that regularly attracted national attention. It was compact, it's friendly, stitched together by streets that carried people from their homes to schools and back again. You could stand on the sidewalk and see life move almost rhythmically. Children crossing with backpacks, neighbors waving from porches. The hum of a small town moving through time at its own pace. It was, at least from the outside, a place where you could imagine your family being safe. And then, on one ordinary weekday afternoon, Patricia Viola disappeared. She left her home and never returned. There was no scene of violence, no shattered glass, no slashed screens or broken locks. Nothing had been turned upside down. There was no sign that someone had forced their way into her life. One moment she was part of the everyday fabric of her family and town, and then, inexplicably, she was gone. And a few minutes from now, we're going to reach the point in the investigation, that anchor moment, where everyone realized that the absence itself might be the only real clue they were ever going to get. That this case was not built on trauma exploding outward, but on mystery folding inward, quietly and relentlessly. This is the disappearance of Patricia Viola, and it begins not with violence, not with screams, not with the kind of theatrical horror people expect from true crime stories, but with a quiet winter day and the simple, impossible truth that a woman went out into the world and never came back. Welcome back to The Devil Within. Tonight, we step into a case that has never offered the clean narrative arcs that TV crime dramas promise us. There are no suspects lined up neatly, no courtroom showdown where someone breaks down and confesses, no final sweeping revelation that explains everything. Instead, what remains is something heavier, something slower, more intimate. The disappearance of Patricia Viola, a wife and mother whose absence settled into the lives of the people who loved her like a permanent season. What makes the story unsettling is not what we can prove happened, but what we may never fully understand. Patricia lived with medical struggles, including seizures. She lived with love and responsibility and daily life and ordinary pressures. She lived with the invisible balancing act that so many people quietly perform, managing both hope and fear in the same breath. And that's where the darker theme emerges. Sometimes the devil within isn't another person. Sometimes it isn't an intruder lurking in shadows, or a figure waiting behind a locked door, or a demon taking control of someone's soul. Sometimes it's something internal: illness, despair, neurological storms, exhaustion, the haunting belief that you're becoming a burden, or simply the unbearable quiet of grief or confusion. Sometimes the devil within is a weight a person carries privately, a weight nobody else can fully see, and which, in the end, proves stronger than all the hands reaching out to steady them. Threaded through the story, Echoing like the snow-laden imagery in Robert Frost's lines about dark woods and unkept promises is the unsettling truth that not every disappearance begins with evil intent. Some begin with pain that has gone unspoken for far too long. And yet, this does not make the story less haunting. It makes it more human. Chapter 1. The Day She Didn't Come Home. On February 13th, 2001, there was nothing prophetic in the morning air. It was a Tuesday. The sky moved in that dull winter way, shifting between gray and, lighter gray. Children went to school, adults went to work or appointments, coffee was poured, conversations were had, and nobody had any reason to believe that this day would mark a dividing line between before and after. Patty Viola was 42 years old. She lived in Bogota with her husband and their children. People described her as kind, gentle, and compassionate. She loved her family. She participated in the slow rituals that knit together small-town life. To most observers, her world would have appeared stable, ordinary, perhaps even comfortingly familiar. But private life is rarely as simple as it looks from the outside. Patty had medical issues. We mentioned the seizures, which can disrupt not only the physical body, but the emotional landscape around it. Illness often brings fear. It also brings fatigue. It sometimes complicates identity. Even when surrounded by love, people living with chronic medical conditions often feel as though the world has secretly changed its rules and failed to give them the updated manual. None of this exists as a neat explanation. It exists as texture, as context, the background environment in which the rest of the story unfolds. Now, at some point that day, Patty left her home. She didn't take a suitcase. She didn't leave any kind of message, long or short. She didn't announce a change in plans. She simply wasn't there anymore. When her husband returned and discovered she was gone, the quiet of the house didn't feel peaceful. It felt wrong. He did what people do when reality suddenly refuses to line up with expectation. He called, he checked, he retraced. He hoped the absence would prove to be a misunderstanding. But it didn't. Police were notified, and the search began quickly. Flyers were distributed, neighbors were questioned, areas were canvassed, and yet, almost immediately, the investigation ran into a peculiar and deeply frustrating wall. There was no crime scene. The home showed no forced entry. There were no bloody footprints, no shattered objects, nothing that shouted, "Hey, something violent happened here." The house looked like the aftermath of an ordinary day, which meant that investigators were not pursuing trauma outward. They were pursuing silence inward. They needed to build a timeline, but time itself had already betrayed them. No one could say precisely when she left. No one could lock down the last conversation with full certainty. The hours blurred together the way winter afternoons tend to do, and the clarity required to reconstruct the precise moment of disappearance seemed always just a shade out of reach. Outside, winter did what winter always does. It absorbed sound and layered the world in stillness. There's something about snow that feels deceptive. As, again, my favorite, Robert Frost, observed, something gentle and beautiful that masks the fact that beneath it, the ground remains hard, unforgiving, and indifferent. And in Bogota, New Jersey, February of 2001 became the beginning of a winter that never quite ended. Chapter 2, where the trail stops speaking. When a person disappears without evidence of a crime, investigators are forced into a very delicate balancing act. On one side lies the possibility that the disappearance was voluntary, a choice made in a moment of despair or panic or confusion. On the other side lies the possibility of an accident, a medical emergency, or something tragic and sudden that left no straightforward trail. And, always hovering in the shadows, is the possibility of foul play. Someone else stepping into the narrative and altering its course. Now, to their credit, officers and detectives did not rush to judgment. They interviewed family and friends and neighbors. They considered her medical history. They tracked down leads, most of which dissolved upon contact. They coordinated with agencies beyond Bogota, because once a person steps out into the world, their path can stretch in any direction. But very little came back. Her bank accounts didn't light up. Her identity didn't suddenly appear in another state. Calls and leads popped up and faded, one after another. Days turned into weeks. And here is where that moment we spoke of quietly emerged. Not in an explosion of insight, but in a gradual, collective understanding among those involved. They realized that they might not be looking at a story with a single dramatic villain. There might be no stranger to identify, no confrontation to reconstruct, no singular event that could serve as the center of the narrative. The truth may not have lived outside of Patricia, but within her. Now, this was not a declaration. It wasn't a conclusion stamped onto official paperwork. It was, instead, a widening of perspective, a painful willingness to consider that neurological illness, mental health, exhaustion, grief, or some combination of internal forces might have played a more powerful role than anyone initially imagined. That realization is terrifying, because if there's no villain, then there's nothing we can tell ourselves to avoid, no behavioral rule we can follow to stay safe, no monster waiting outside of the door to take the blame. It also means that the devil within, in this case, may very well be the combination of private suffering and invisible illness that isolates people, even when they're surrounded by those who care deeply for them. As the investigation stretched on, time behaved differently. At first, every hour was alive with urgency. Then urgency gave way to ritual. Search results became anniversaries. Press releases turned quieter. Hope didn't disappear, but it rearranged itself into a quieter, more patient form. And then, the story shifted. Not abruptly, not with television drama, but in the slow, unhurried way that rivers have of returning what they once carried away. Years later, along the shoreline, partial human remains were discovered. Not immediately identified, not loudly proclaimed. But eventually, DNA work confirmed it. They belonged to Patricia Viola. Science could tell us that this was Patty, but it couldn't tell us how she arrived there. Chapter 3. What the water would not say. So bodies of water don't confess. They simply hold. They cradle what enters them, they move it, they erode it, they carry it, and eventually, when conditions shift, they release what remains. What the shoreline returned was not a full body, and not a complete explanation, but fragments. Heartbreaking confirmation that Patty had died, paired with the unyielding refusal to tell us how. And in that moment, the story split in two. On the one hand, there was relief. Not happiness, never happiness, but the closure of knowing that she was no longer simply missing. She'd been found, at least in part. She hadn't been erased. On the other hand, a deeper and perhaps more haunting question remained. What happened? Was it an accident? A medical episode that led her to wander and then collapse? Was it a deliberate act? A decision made in a moment when the weight she carried felt unbearable? Was there someone else involved whose presence left no trace strong enough to survive investigation? Silence, once again, became the dominant narrator. Forensic science, extraordinary as it can be, still needs evidence to speak. Fragmented remains can't always reconstruct an entire final journey. Without witnesses, without surveillance, without definitive marks of violence, interpretations remain cautious, incomplete, unresolved. And that's where this story still lives, in a place defined less by what we know than by what we can't say. If we return for a minute to Robert Frost, as I'm wont to do, and to his solitary figure standing in the darkness beside quiet, snow-filled woods, we sense a familiar echo. Promises to keep, miles to go, obligations tugging him forward, and beneath it all, an awareness of rest, of sleep, waiting patiently in the distance. Life makes demands, the world expects endurance, but the mind and the heart, they don't always align with those expectations. In Patty Viola's story, the devil within is not a cinematic demon or a murderous intruder. It's the combination of internal forces, illness, exhaustion, despair, isolation, that can sometimes pull a person away from the people who love them without leaving clear evidence for the rest of us to decode. It's the human tendency to underestimate those invisible storms until it's too late to understand them. And layered beneath that is another devil, one that lives inside us as observers and storytellers. Our relentless hunger for neat conclusions, tidy villains, clean arcs, and explanations that make us ultimately feel safe. When reality refuses to comply, we're left with the same thing Patty's family was left with: absence and ache, memory and unanswered questions. Her story didn't conclude with closure. It concluded with fragments. And still she mattered. She still matters. A life doesn't simply vanish because our language can't fully explain its ending. So cases like this resist entertainment. They deny us the sharp satisfaction of outrage, the catharsis of justice delivered, the narrative triumph of truth neatly revealed. Instead, these cases insist that we sit with something that we don't often practice sitting with: uncertainty paired with compassion. Patricia Viola disappeared during a quiet winter. Partial remains confirmed what no one wanted to believe, and yet the full truth remains beyond our reach. And so we honor her, not by inventing villains, but by acknowledging the complexity of the human condition, by admitting that mental health and neurological illness are forces as real and dangerous as knives or bullets, and by remembering that invisibility doesn't mean insignificance. Sometimes the devil within is silence itself, the silence in systems that fail to notice when someone is drowning internally, the silence produced by stigma, the silence that grows when people believe their pain will burden others. Unsolved does not mean forgotten. Unfinished does not mean empty. It means there are still promises to keep, and perhaps miles to go. If you're enjoying The Devil Within, follow and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. Leave a rating and review. It genuinely helps new listeners discover the show. And share this episode with someone who believes compassion belongs in true crime. If you have thoughts, responses, or simply want to reach out, info@evocreative.com. And you can explore everything we're building at evocreative.com. And if you or someone you know is struggling, overwhelmed, feeling lost, or carrying more than you can say, reach out, find someone, call someone, speak to someone. You deserve to be heard. We'll see you next time on The Devil Within. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.